Okay, for this next part, we're going to be working in After Effects. This could be the first time that you've looked at After Effects, and it can be pretty daunting, but with exposure and practice, you will get familiar with the tool and you'll get good at it. Let's start slowly and just do a few simple things to create our animated collage. First thing to do is to import our PSD that we created in After Effects. Remember, it was a layered PSD, and we'll see how useful that is when we import that. File, import, file, and we'll select our found objects. We're going to make sure that we import that as a composition retaining layer sizes, and we'll ensure that we don't click any of those other radio buttons, and we'll click open. We'll be presented with a second dialog box which shows our import kind and that we are importing editable layer styles. So our drop shadow that we applied in Photoshop will be editable in After Effects as well. And we'll click OK. So that imports our PSD as a composition. This is what a composition icon looks like in our project window. This is where we'll see all of the assets in our project. If I double click on that composition, you'll see that our artwork appears in our composition window and we have a timeline, and so this is kind of integral to After Effects, this idea of time and adding time to our graphics. So it's kind of a combination of visuals and time. I'll bring your attention to the composition menu up here. So this is something that we'll be often returning to, and the composition settings. So we did set this up in Photoshop. We changed the canvas size, but we can edit those settings in the composition settings in After Effects. We'll open that up and you can see that we've got a name to our composition. There are the dimensions of our project, 16:9, and it's recognized that as a social media preset, a portrait preset for TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, and so on. It's set our frame rate to 30 frames per second, and that will be fine for us at the moment. You might have to, or you might want to change that to 30 frames if you've got something different there. And I'm setting the duration of our project or our composition to 6 seconds. So that's hours, minutes, seconds, and then frames here. And I'll click OK. So the fundamental principle of creating animation in a tool like this is creating a difference between the values of two properties over time, and we do that by creating what they call keyframes. Let's create 2 keyframes so that I can demonstrate how we animate things in After Effects. I'm going to turn off 1, 2, 3 layers and just have our flower layer visible. We'll need to twirl down this little arrow here to show our transformation properties here. And also when I twirl down that arrow, we can see our layer styles there. So you know that our layer styles might be editable in the future and also animatable or keyframeable. Anyway, so I'm going to isolate the rotation property here. So that's obviously our object turning around in space on an axis. You can see that we've got our rotation property, and then to the right of that we've got the value for that property, and currently those values are set to 0. If I scrub those values, you can see that our object rotates. There is also a rotation tool in the toolbar, and I can grab that and I can rotate. I can click and drag in the composition window to rotate my object as well. I'm going to go back to the selection tool. At this point, I'm going to make some keyframes. I'm going to click on this stopwatch icon here at the left of the rotation property, and that creates a keyframe in the timeline, a little diamond, which I can move around, and I can delete, hitting delete on the keyboard if I want to. Just reinstate that. And then I'm going to make a further keyframe, and that keyframe, just sorry before I go on, that keyframe records this value's properties at that particular point in time, which is 0. I'm going to move my timeline indicator, this little scrubbing thing, to right to the end, so that's at the kind of pretty close to 6-second mark, and I'm going to add another keyframe there. So firstly I hit the stopwatch, and then secondary subsequent keyframes I hit this little button here, and that's going to record those values at that point in time there. But I want to actually change those values between this keyframe and that keyframe, and so I'm going to do that by adding in maybe 180, so that's 180 degrees, and you can see that that's flipped around. But now if I scrub through time, you can see that in between those keyframes, After Effects is filling in all of the in-between frames and creating that animation. If I hit the spacebar on the keyboard, it'll play my animation, or I could use the preview kind of remote control options. I've got a play button, and I've also got a couple of other buttons to move my timeline indicator around in the timeline, frame by frame, start of composition, start timeline, end of timeline, and play. Great, so we've made our first animation. That is a bit faster than what I wanted. I want it to be kind of a slow, subtle or understated animation. So I can edit that animation if I want to. I could drag the timeline indicator back to that point, and then I could change that value. I could scrub that value, or I could type in a new value, or I could double click that keyframe and bring up its property values for that particular point in time. So currently it's set to 0 rotations, but 180 degrees. I'm going to drop that down to 90 degrees, and then it will be moving slower, hitting space on the keyboard. And that's pretty good. I like that. You can see how our drop shadow stays in kind of relation to the surface. It doesn't rotate around like the object is, which is kind of useful. Although, the lighting of the poor lighting of my original photograph isn't perfect. There's a kind of a vignette across that graphic. Anyway, that's our first animation, and we rotated. We made some keyframes on the rotation property and changed those over time. Let's do that again. I'm going to bring up that photograph of the curious woman with the torn edge of the photograph. Don't know what that's about. It's been in my studio for a long time. Can't even remember where I've got that from. Let's animate a couple of properties this time, so more than one property at the same time. I'm going to start by by animating the position. So I've created a keyframe at 0, and I'm going to move through right to the end of the timeline there, and I'm going to use the move tool or the selection tool just to animate that asset in so I can see that person's face. And that's created animation. You can see in the composition window we have what they call, I'm just using the spacebar to move around there, what we call a motion path. And so that's a kind of a visual of the change over time. All right, so we've animated the position. let's animate the scale as well. So I'm going to click moving the timeline indicator right back to the start there. I'm going to create a scale keyframe, and at the end of the timeline I'm going to change that value. I could do it here by scrubbing, or I can actually grab the corner of one of these handles here and I can change that in the window. If I hold shift, I can constrain those proportions. So that's good. We've got position and scale. I think I want to just move that over here there. Just being careful to make sure that I am hovering, or the timeline indicator is right over the top of those keyframes. I don't want to make another keyframe. But we're building on the kind of complexity of this animation, aren't we? And we'll do that with a further iteration. Let's rotate the asset as well, adding a keyframe for rotation, and then a secondary keyframe, and I'll just scrub that keyframe value a little bit so that the scale of the asset is changing, the position is changing, now the rotation is changing. Excellent. Let's reiterate that process another couple of times to really embed it. We'll bring the leaves into position now, and I think I'll just change the position of the leaves. So we'll add a keyframe and move through to the end of the timeline and something like that. So I'm reasonably happy with that, and then right in the background we're going to have the card, and it might just rotate from one side to the other. So twirling down the rotation property, oops, see that added the keyframe where my timeline indicator was. I'm just going to delete that keyframe and move my timeline indicator right to the start. Right at the end, rotate that around like so. And hitting space on the keyboard to trigger the playback. And I think that'll do for my animated collage, animating 4 found objects over time. And I think I'm kind of happy with that, ready to go. Now, just for the hell of it, I might add one more asset, and that's a piece of sound. We don't have to use Photoshop as the kind of the generator of our assets, although it is good. We can also use lots of other types of multimedia, for example, sound. We can also import just flat image files like JPEGs, or video files like MP4 files, QuickTime files, etc. Lots of different assets. So I'm just going to go back to the import file, going to navigate to this MP3 that I've downloaded from the YouTube sound library, and you can see that that's been added to our project asset list here, and then I can drag that into our composition, and you might not hear that in the recording, but I've added another sound. Cool. So happy with this. We'll be back in a second to export this out as a final MP4.